Immediately on my left is Eva Amsen. Eva completed a PhD in biochemistry at the University of Toronto. She blogs about science in art and pop culture at easternblot.net and about the culture of science, especially online culture, at Expression Patterns on Nature Network. Tedra Osell is a writer, former English professor, mom, and sometime public intellectual. She's taught at research universities, community colleges, and elementary schools, and is currently, these I think are her words in her bio, thinking really hard about her next paid gig. Claire Potter is professor of history and American studies at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. She specializes in United States political history, queer studies, and the history of gender, sex, and feminism. She's the author of War on Crime, Bandits, G-Men, and the Politics of Mass Culture, which was published by Rutgers University Press. She's currently finishing a book about William Archibald Dunning, and she's beginning a third book about feminist anti-pornography campaigns in the 1970s and 1980s. She can also be found at her blog, Tenured Radical.
I started blogging while I was doing my PhD in biochemistry at the University of Toronto, and I just wanted to talk a bit about science in general to a public, general audience, because I felt that a lot of people didn't really know what I was doing in the lab and why I spent so much time in the lab. And while I was doing that, I found that it created some opportunities for writing. So I actually decided, after I finished my PhD, to not go on and do a postdoc, but instead do more science writing. And I'm currently applying for jobs in a more science communication sphere, so connecting scientists rather than being one myself. And that's what my blog basically helped me decide.
I started my blog, I think I was on the market. And I'd had my son while I was finishing my dissertation, and I'd been really active on a forum called Hip Mama, and there was a big brouhaha over kind of unarticulated racism of a lot of the women on the forums, and eventually they shut down the forums because the people who were moderating it just didn't want to deal with the headaches anymore and the big flame wars. So a bunch of us went off and started live journals and kind of linked to each other and did that kind of little community thing. But more and more, as I was kind of moving away from thinking primarily in terms of being online as a mom to things I wanted to talk about my job search and academia as well, and my kind of ambivalence about identifying as an academic, I wanted a more public forum. So I started a Blogspot blog, and I was talking with my old college roommate one night online, and we were trying to come up with a title that was kind of a snappy title. So I have to credit her. Bitch Ph.D. was her suggestion, not mine. But it turned out to be really kind of a good, snappy title. Although I hear tell that sometimes it's blocked from certain public libraries and such. But it's really evolved, I think, over the years. I think it's 5 years old now, maybe going on my 6th year. Now I have co-bloggers. I didn't used to. I haven't taught, or I had a tenure-track job for 3 years, and I was very careful about my anonymity at the time. And then when I left that job to move back to the West Coast of the United States, I got a little more open about my identity and stuff. And so now my kind of rule of thumb is officially Bitch Ph.D. as a pseudonym, and on the blog I never mention my own name, but I don't worry about it elsewhere. Oh, okay. What I was saying is that I don't use my name on my blog. Bitch Ph.D. is her own kind of character, basically, a persona. My dissertation work was on 18th century periodical publication. And I was specifically interested in the authorial personae for these 18th century periodicals, whether it's the Tatler and the Spectator, but there were also a lot of really little ones, some by women, some by people who we still don't know who they were. So the more I blogged, the more interested I got, both because of my own kind of research in this field, but also in terms of the constant arguments about whether people should be allowed to post anonymously on the internet, which comes up every once in a while, in that weird kind of author positioning where you're pseudonymous as opposed to properly anonymous, right? There's an ongoing persona that has some kind of credibility. So I'm very firmly on the idea that people should be allowed to post anonymously. But in any case, the topics of the blog now are mom stuff a lot of the time, political stuff still, because I'm still very interested in that. My co-blogger, Sybil Vane, just accepted a tenure-track job, and so she's kind of the academic right now. And my other two co-bloggers, one is a lawyer, and the other works for a nonprofit. And I am currently, as a matter of fact, it's funny that I'd forgotten that in my bio I said I was thinking really hard about my next paid gig, but I'm actually in the process of having just been drafted to teach a writing course for one of the local community colleges, and I haven't actually officially told them I'll do it, but I'm getting emails from them about your 101 course and all of this kind of stuff, and the course is already 6 weeks into the semester, so I'm really not sure I want to take this on, but I have a feeling that when I get back, I'm going to end up in front of a classroom next week, kind of, you know, flying by the seat of my pants, so I guess that's my next paid gig.
Today, I am close to my third, what we call Blogoversary, which is 3 years from my first post on October 17th, 2006, when I explained to my as yet unknown audience that, quote, long ago when the new right decided to undermine the intellectual foundations of the nation, one of the big charges made by radical neocons was that universities were full of tenured radicals who were indoctrinating the youth of America. The not-so-big secret, of course, is that universities and their faculties are far from radical, and that tenure is one of the features of university life that makes academics cautious at best, conservative at least. So, of course, I called myself Tenured Radical, and my blog was going to solve this problem. I can't say whether my blog has actually changed anything in the world, but I do know that it has changed me. I've become interested in the uses of new technology for teaching and scholarship, in how technology alters public conversations and how it does not, and in what it means to create a scholarly arena where people can disagree about ideas across time, space, and status. But blogging is first and foremost about writing, and writing in a way that foregrounds play as well as intellect. This makes blogging fundamentally different from how we were all brought up to write in graduate school, which is that writing is our principal work. Think about it. One of the earliest conventions we learn as graduate students is to greet a new person not by asking, "What are you writing?" but by saying, "What are you working on?" In a book I would recommend to all of you, Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, Lamott goes on at hilarious length about hating the act of writing. This is a situation familiar to many scholars and one often accentuated for women. Our institutions are all sexist to a greater or lesser degree, and the lack of sustained feminist critique, yes they are, the lack of sustained feminist critique in the real world often reduces structural problems that prevent us from writing to a set of random anecdotal grievances. Now, part of why Lamott's book appeals to me is that she talks about this problem in a funny and not a tragic way. And this was a lesson I took to my blogging about the academy. There is virtually no academic script that does not relate the difficulties of one's writing career as having a tragic and permanently damaging outcome. Such outcomes might include not finishing a dissertation, the loss of a job, or worse, if you really imagine yourself as a writer, the fear that you may never write again. What Lamott argues is that there is no way to solve the problem of writing but to write, and to do it every day. Let me repeat, you must write every day. Blogging helped me do that. My essays have drawn a broad audience within and outside the academy, including a military wife, an oil man in Dubai, some sock puppets who live in Brooklyn, and a manic woman who writes practically in poetry and calls herself the diva, who I actually think is probably a man. Many academic bloggers gather a devoted cadre of like-minded followers who advise and encourage them. This can be particularly helpful to those who are assistant professors or graduate students when they must cope with anxiety or bad news. One young medievalist, new kid on the hallway, did not have her contract renewed at third-year review. New kid received an outpouring of sympathy, the kind of thing I can say from experience that you are not likely to get from your actual colleagues, both because it is awkward and because you are hiding in your office weeping. But as she worked out her final year, moved to a visiting job, and then went on to law school, she was also able to draw on a substantial network of junior and senior people for advice about how to navigate these transitions. Which brings me back to the question of anonymity, which is something we may want to discuss more fully. Anonymity allows people, many of whom are untenured, to write about volatile and contentious issues and to establish a clear boundary between their academic writing and their blogging. As I said earlier, I began anonymously and came out about 6 months into my career as the Tenured Radical. I came out for a variety of reasons, but principally because I had been unmasked at my own institution and had been for at least 3 months before I discovered it. And I also came out because I came to believe at that point that remaining anonymous or pseudonymous had led me to make ethical compromises I would not otherwise have made. Coming out also got my work to a wider audience. I have been invited to join group blogs, write for print and internet publications for money, be on panels about blogging like this one, do a cluster on feminist blogging for an academic journal, and I have met really interesting people. I have been linked to and written for a variety of prestigious publications on the right and on the left, such as National Review Online, The Village Voice, American Historical Association Perspectives Online, I don't know whether they're on the right or the left, the American Federation of Teachers weblog, Inside Higher Ed, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. In other words, I am read, which is the principal thing you want as a writer. So in addition to making me think harder, write more, and I think write better, I have, in conventional and unconventional ways, acquired what every academic and every writer wants, an audience. What blogging also allowed me to do was to think seriously and productively about what brought me to this profession in the first place and work specifically to make that thing happen in a new way. Blogging allows me to write short pieces, work on form, voice, and getting complex ideas across to an audience that I need to entice every day in order to keep them reading. I sometimes compare it to a pianist playing scales. To the extent that blogging is not perhaps the most serious scholarly form, to take it seriously is to become a better writer and a better thinker. I write every day, not just on weekends and in the summer, as I often did when writing was the work that came last because it required so much more focus and commitment. This has obviously reshaped my writing practice. Time spent doing teaching or chairing is time when I am taking a break from writing and not the other way around. Even if large projects are completed slowly, to write every day is to keep continuity in my creative habits that nurtures a sense of connection to my intellect. I have come to embrace what is a generative but often unpleasant reality of the scholarly world, given our system of high-stakes evaluation, that sometimes there are people who really hate what you believe is your best work, and you need to listen to them anyway. As a blogger, I also get to be a historian who engages regularly with what happened yesterday, or contemporary history, as I call it, a messy and exhilarating business. That said, this kind of intellectual work on the internet is considered highly suspect by many scholars my age and older, in part because there are virtually no rules that govern blogging, and the university world is obsessed with rules and the respectability that comes with following the rules. Blogging is also an activity associated most strongly with the young, which makes a middle-aged scholar blogger like myself even more suspect. I've had conversations with some colleagues in which you would have thought they were talking to someone who had taken up competitive skateboarding at the age of 50. The comparison may be an apt one, but if so, I'm having the best kind of middle-aged crisis because I am constantly learning new things. Blogging has, it is true, involved me in some unpleasant interactions in the university world, which I'd be happy to talk about. However, in addition to connecting me to intelligent people outside the academy, it has also included me in a diverse intellectual circle of scholars, most of them younger scholars who know things that I don't know. This, in turn, has allowed me to re-engage with older colleagues with a sharpened sense of consciousness about what higher education and the community of scholars ought to be doing for and with those who are its future. And I truly believe that younger people are the future, and that technology is that way. for older people to connect to them best, which, again, I can talk about when we're done.
A theme that emerged from the presentations, and that's also represented here on the questions that I have that I can certainly use to get going, is a pair of issues that's hard for me to separate. First of all, Cheryl Spinner has asked, as scholarly women bloggers, what does the pseudonym mean to you? Did you consider going by your own name? Why choose a pseudonym like Tenured Radical or Bitch Ph.D., issues about feminism? And a paired question, a question that I'd like to juxtapose at any rate, is from Carolyn Johnson, who asks, what are good boundaries for blogging for academics who do not have tenured positions? And she has added the observation, we want academic freedom, but do not want to risk our blogs negatively impacting our hiring potential. So I know for a lot of grad students and untenured faculty, these are issues. I'll perhaps put those two issues, the question about pseudonyms versus claiming an identity that's aligned with a real-world identity, and also the question about different stages of academia and the ways that the stage that you're at might affect the choices that you make.
I chose the name Tenured Radical because I thought it was funny. And my partner is, every once in a while, says to me, you know, you better stay out of the way of that Carrie Nelson man because you stole the title of his book. And every once in a while, I do wonder, like, if I run into Carrie Nelson, is he really going to be mad, or is he as good-humored as he seems to be? I thought it was funny, and I'm actually shocked that I got it. But it has sort of become me on a certain level. There's not actually that much difference between my personality and my blog personality. And I think of Tenured Radical as being sort of a contradiction in terms, which is how I think of my position in the academy in many ways, is as a contradiction in terms. As an out lesbian, as a feminist, and as someone who actually in lots of ways doesn't believe in tenure, which I don't want to divert our conversation by talking about that, but I'm also, particularly at this historical moment, very glad that I have it. And that it does, in fact, permit me a certain freedom to say what I think. And I say a certain freedom, not complete freedom. I think the question of what kind of relation your blog actually might have to your career is a really, really fraught one, and something that everybody has to decide for themselves. Perhaps it's just my personality, but I found that I was way too unbuttoned when I was pseudonymous. It was much easier for me to displace all kinds of things that I would not say to people's faces onto the blog. And because I deal with contentious academic issues, I think it was very important for me to deal with that. I think there's a related issue, which I think is a problem with anonymity and pseudonymity, which is sort of what I mentioned before. People knew who I was months before I decided to come out, and I found out very much like by accident. And there is this kind of dynamic. I don't know if any of you ever had somebody read your journal or read somebody else's journal, read somebody else's diary when you weren't supposed to be doing it. But there is this kind of thing that takes over where people will read your blog, but they don't want to tell you that they're reading because that would be too embarrassing to let you know that they know who you are. And that's a problem for many reasons, but one of them is that in the academy, a great many people are narcissists, frankly. So that you know, they imagine yourselves, even if you're using pseudonyms, like I had one pseudonymous character in the blog whose name was Dr. Grumpo. And he was sort of an amalgam of many people I knew and didn't know. And I can't tell you how many people believed that they were Dr. Grumpo, okay? So that's a problem too, is that people misunderstand, and they misread, and they read themselves into your blog. Why should you care about that? It's hurtful. It actually disrupts your real-time relations with people and real-world relations with people. In ways that aren't, in the end, productive, either socially or intellectually.
Okay, I'm amused because I'm going to say almost all the opposite things.
Good.
I nobody that I worked with knew that the blog was me, that I know of, partly because I lied about where I was. I said I was in the upper Midwest in America, and really I was in Ontario. And I did things like, you know, swap the genders of my department chair, stuff like that. But when I did come out and start identifying myself to people, I had people who had been reading the blog and who thought that someone else was them. So, for instance, I had a character when I was still blogging about work who I used the pseudonym Hooker Boots for, and he thought Hooker Boots was someone else who was a friend of mine. And I said, no, Hooker Boots was you. So instead of having everybody think that they were the person, everybody thought the person was somebody else. I didn't have I was very surprised. I didn't have any negative repercussions from the blog. And like I say, I was extremely careful about coming out. The only negative thing I had is some crazy person who threatened a lawsuit. But that didn't have anything to do with my professional stuff. If anything, I think that the people who subsequently found out about the blog, a few grad student friends who did figure out that it was me, were pleased with it, liked it. Because one of the things that I tried to do with it is to be open about my own ambivalence, but not so much, I didn't bitch a lot about other people. I kind of bitched about my own kind of position in the academy and do I really want to be doing this or not. But I was careful about that even so. Strangely, that said, I too have become more careful since I'm out, but what I'm more careful about, and this really bothers me, is my private life. I'm more careful about writing honestly about what I'm doing now that I'm a housewife than I was as an academic, because the person who I would be writing about would be my husband, right, or my, you know, people who I am intimate with. So I'm thinking a lot about what that means in terms of the whole personal, public juxtaposition that I like messing around with in the blog. That said, boundaries for untenured academics, you know, I would say better safe than sorry, right? That said, you know, anything that you write, it is a form of publication. It is a public statement. So that's true whether or not you're pseudonymous, whether or not you're anonymous. So I've always, that's why I think I've always been very careful not to bitch about people who piss me off. I will talk about the situations that frustrate me, or I'll talk about issues that bother me, but I've always tried to kind of not personalize them. The stuff that I'll personalize is things that are funny, or when somebody says something that I think is really apropos. But I think that, I mean, that's just kind of generic sort of professionalism, I guess.
I might just chime in briefly here, and Eva has a comment too, and you've most recently been a graduate student, I think, on this panel, so you may speak directly. I'm in a little bit different of a position than the two of you in that when I started my blog, which I think was around 2003, I was an untenured professor. I now have tenure, but it was always a blog under my name. My name is in the Blogspot address that I chose. And although really it was very much just as a form of writerly play for me, it was vaguely linked in my mind to the fact that I just published my first novel, and it was clear to me that I had traveled on very little money to do a number of readings at a number of places, but it was clear to me that the future of book promotion was going to be very much online, and I thought that it would be useful for me to develop a blogging voice and a set of blogging habits, like before my next novel was published, so I wasn't trying to learn in a hurry, you know, on the spot. So I always had that particular kind of a public readership in mind that needed to be tied to my other publishing identity. And I also found very quickly that some of my first readers were in fact my students at Columbia, both undergraduates and graduate students. And I have found my blog, which I think is less an academic blog than, as I say, a kind of commonplace book for things that catch my eye, that interest me. I have found it an incredibly valuable instigator of conversations with people who I have other relationships with also, but who I can have a whole second level of conversation with on the basis of the things that I raise on my blog. So for me, it would have been, it just literally never occurred to me to blog anonymously, and it also has always seemed to me the tenure, not tenure thing is a bit of a red herring, because in some ways the strongest obligations, you know, you have to have the sort of, perhaps the self-respect that involves not bearing your most painful negative emotions constantly for everybody to read, but also the kind of respect for others, especially with privacy issues, that you would hope to have for yourself. And certainly, you know, as a professor, I have now and again found a blog post on a student's blog about a conversation with me, and I certainly would prefer not to see those, but I also feel that I have a stronger obligation to students' privacy than the student has to my privacy, right? So I have always been very careful about not discussing really most aspects of my professional life. If you think, like, what if a candidate who's being what if I'm on a search committee and a candidate's being interviewed for a job at Columbia and they're Googling the names of the search committee members? That would be a natural way to do research. You would get told as a job candidate, these 5 people will be meeting you at the MLA. Does that candidate need to see me saying, gosh, I had the most tedious meeting this afternoon reading these awful files? You know, you think about that sort of obligation to others, and I find that actually by far the most constricting set of silencers, much more than anything about how people evaluating my career, you know, for tenure would be thinking about it.
Yeah, can you pull up the Eastern Bloc blog on the screen? So I started this blog when I was a graduate student, I think in my 2nd year. And it's a very silly science blog. So I think the top post up there has 2 YouTube videos about songs about science. And this had absolutely nothing to do with my research. And in the sciences, when you work in a lab as a graduate student, you're basically a very cheap employee. So you're a student in the sense that you get paid a stipend, but you don't get vacation, and you're an employee in the sense that you're working for your boss and you're doing the experiments that gets her the grant to stay in her job. So I started out, I used my first name but not my last name, simply because I didn't want to show up in Google with this silly blog when I was actually, you know, working in a lab and representing my boss and looking for work. But I didn't realize that there was actually a faculty member in my department who also had a blog, and he eventually found out my last name, and I think that's how I was outed. But at the time, I didn't mind anymore, because what happens in science blogging is that it's over the years since I started, it got more and more respect, and there are several collectives where scientists are blogging. Scienceblogs.com was the first one. I think Nature Network was the second one, and they invited me to keep a blog there, which is my other blog. I don't know if you want to pull that up too, don't have to. And that is completely with my full name, first name, last name. It was one of their requirements. And there are science blogging conferences. I went to a few conferences where people just talk about blogging and what it's like to write about science and how it's seen in the media. Several newspapers use various science blogs as their source for news. So it just became more and more serious, and for me there was no need to be pseudonymous at all. But that being said, there is a big group of people, and they are mainly women, who are blogging anonymously about their science career. And they mostly write about how hard it is to get tenure and how hard it is to combine working 60 hours in a lab with raising a child. But I never got to that stage, so it just didn't pertain to me.
Something that I think is kind of emerging. I mean, it sounds to me like we're all saying that blogging while untenured or blogging while academic is surprisingly unproblematic, which is my experience too. But I'm kind of bothered by what I'm feeling like is kind of an assumption that we're all making, that there are some things that are for private discourse and there are some things that are for public discourse, and you know, you talk about them in the bar, but you don't talk about them in public, because at least a big part of what I was trying to do with my blog was to talk about the anxieties And I think that that's why you get questions like that, that, you know, is it, as a grad student or as someone who's untenured, is it safe for me to blog? There's a lot of neurosis, narcissism, whatever you want to call it, that academics have, particularly pre-tenure academics. And a lot of those job market stuff and all of that. But I think that the more open we collectively are about that kind of thing, the better. As you know, as you were saying, it is for everybody. That it turns out that it's something that everybody shares. And to me, that was part of what was surprisingly unproblematic about being in academic blogging, is that I wasn't really voicing anything that was that unique. So I just kind of want to throw a caution in there that the whole, you know, these are things that you should keep private. Presumption is one that I want people to not just accept uncritically, I guess.
I wonder if I could sort of jump on that too, because I think one of the things being a blogger has really raised for me is what is public and what is private. And specifically for women, I mean, I think it's a really important feminist question. I think it's a really important question for queers, that we aren't actually permitted privacy in the sense that, you know, more established people in the community are permitted privacy. I mean, you know, one of the things that people talk about, for example, and that I've recently gotten into a tussle with some bloggers about, is parenthood. Okay? Okay? Yeah. I mean, is parenting private?
A tussle is an understatement. The internet was exploding with ire in response to a post that Claire wrote.
And tears, and, you know, there was great distress. And there were sort of two related problems. One was I was annoyed because the post I had put up, from my point of view, was not really about parents. And I was like, why do you people have to put yourself in the middle of everything all the time? But the question that was being raised was, you know, why isn't parenthood something that is a public issue, you know? And that we as parents are always being, and they argued that I had actually taken this stance, that parenthood is a problem for a larger public, or it's figured that way in the academy, rather than being figured as something that needs to be solved, right? And so where is the private and where is the public when you are a parent in the academy with our crazy schedules and the expectation that you will work until the job is done? And I also think for women, I mean, you know, one of the big themes in the blogosphere is, you know, how do people perceive me? I'm making a great generalization here, but I mostly see women talking about that. I don't see men talking about that. And so are women ever allowed privacy, really, when they're being scrutinized like that? I think is a big question.
Well, I was one of the people who commented on that post, and then later got into it with Dr. Crazy, who's a friend of mine, about the parenting thing. And I think you're exactly right that and it's not just the job versus the private, but it's this presumption that we have that work is over here and everything else is over here. You know, whether that's your family, your sexuality, your gender, your, you know, status as a parent or not a parent, whatever, and that those two things should always be separate. And I think that, you know, again, you know, as a feminist, that's a problematic assumption. So yeah, I have yet to blog on that, but I've been thinking about it. I'm going to get there.
Now this is a good time for us to take a question.
This is a somewhat flipping your previous question on its head and asking about what about the possibility going either now or in the future, your blogging becoming something that is actually respected. And I know, Claire, you have no respect for tenure, but for everybody else who might not have it yet, that might actually be a form of publication that might be rewarded in tenure. And I'd be interested in hearing the panel's ideas on that, including people who already have tenure.
I mean, just a very quick word on this. I think it's a blog is very useful as a broadcasting mechanism for one's academic work. I don't want to take a super conservative line on this, but in terms of what I do on my blog, I'm not honestly writing things. I write very off the cuff. That's the pleasure of it. I can just write and then it's out there. So I certainly find it very useful for facilitating scholarly communication. I link to something that I've published somewhere else, and it makes it easier for an academic in India to write me an email and ask if I could send him the PDF file of my book. It very much facilitates that sort of scholarly communication and scholarly community. But from my point of view, I don't. I would think that the community building aspect of blogging is more strikingly what could or should be counted than the actual writing itself. That I would think that in the sense that blogging, the Tenured Radical blog, you're doing something there that's awfully like service to the discipline, that's like serving on a committee for the MLA or whatever, something like that. So for me, it would be more likely I would think it would be likely that we would see that recognized sooner by tenure and review committees than the actual writing per se.
I think what you're saying about the racial aspect of the private-public distinction, actually, I have two of my co-bloggers are women of color, but the one woman who is the most, the one who wants to write the most about racial issues is also the one who's the least comfortable doing so. And the few times when she does, she's kind of complained that either she gets very little comments or that the comments instantly get derailed into, kind of predictable lines. And yet I'm thinking about other blogs that I read, like Post Bougie is a really good one, where those kind of conversations do happen and the kind of talking about feelings and stuff does happen. And I don't know, I think there's something there about, kind of a feeling of critical mass. Right? That because the feminist blogosphere or the feminist academic blogosphere has kind of gotten to the point where we have panels on this sort of thing and everybody knows who everybody is and stuff, that there is that sense of comfort in a way that I don't think bloggers of color, my perception are quite there yet. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but...
I would just add on a slightly different note. I think, it can be, these things can look things are changing so quickly in terms of social practices and so forth. I was having a conversation recently with a good friend of mine who's probably 8 or 9 years younger than me, and she was a very active blogger and she's in graduate school now. She was a very active blogger when she was an undergraduate, but actually sort of lost her confidence as a blogger as a graduate student because that stage of moving from, let's say, doing coursework in a PhD program into becoming a dissertation writer, having a dissertation project, that is a very costly developmental stage in many ways. A lot of students temporarily lose their voice and have to find it again, and the blogging can feel suddenly much higher stakes and more stressful, I think, especially for people who have been blogging under their own names, who come to internalize all of these sort of censoring mechanisms that have to do with what will other people think about me if they read me writing in a non-scholarly voice when I haven't yet established myself as writing successfully and publicly in a scholarly voice. And so she was sort of ironically referring to herself as part of a lost generation of bloggers. But I do think that these factors can operate very strongly on certain groups for all sorts of reasons.
Well, I would also say, I sort of want to throw two different things in here. It is very, very easy, as a white woman who writes about race a lot in her blog, it's very easy to get mobbed by, wandering groups of very difficult people. And I became a magnet for some of those people because of a blog called Durham in Wonderland. Which is run by a guy named Casey Johnson at Brooklyn College. And that blog has a reputation for turning loose groups of, I don't even know how to describe them, but they're basically like right-wing libertarians. And one of their themes is that if you write about race at all, you are a racist. I mean, bottom line. And they're responsible for actually a lot of damaging stuff. And so there is a group of bloggers out there who is rightly afraid of these people. I mean, because one of the things that happens is when they lock on to you, for example, they started writing letters to the Board of Trustees at Wesleyan and writing letters to my colleagues. I mean, actual letters, not just email, you know, and letters to the president and so on, you know, in that kind of, you know, we have to get these radicals out of the academy, blah, blah, blah. And fortunately, I work at Wesleyan, right? So people would just go, ha, 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 Claire's done it again. But you know, a lot of people are a lot more vulnerable than I am, and they work at places that care a lot more about their public image. So I think race is very fraught in the blogosphere. Now, to sort of address the other question, as a historian, technology is a real paradox for historians, because on the one hand, there's a whole group of people like Josh Freeman and Steve Breyer at the American Social History Project, Roy Rosenzweig, the late Roy Rosenzweig, down at George Mason, who did amazing things with technology before it was popularized in the ways it was. So historians have really been kind of at the forefront of technology. And the profession as a whole has really not dealt with electronic publication, period. So blogging, dealing with blogging is way down the line when the profession can't even agree as to whether a refereed online journal should count for your tenure case. Okay, and so it's very much field by field, and there is no broader discussion that I'm aware of in universities about how to come to terms with our new reality, which is that without money, a lot less is going to be published. And particular fields are going to take really major hits, like European history, for example, is going to take a huge hit.
I just want to get back to the question about whether blogging can be beneficial for getting tenure. There are actually several people in science blogging who put it in their on their CV under outreach activities, and when that is part of the required tenure package, then it definitely is beneficial, especially if they're there with their full name and affiliation on the front page. They're basically promoting their university far wider than they ever could, and for free. And another thing is, this is for me the third time that I've been invited to publicly speak on a panel or give a talk that is a direct result of having a blog. And while the blog itself is not on my CV, these things definitely are. So it can start other projects that are more respected than just having a website somewhere on the internet that anyone can start. So
yeah, I think that's my sense of it, is that it functions well in terms of kind of service or other publications. Like, it's not going to count as a you know, refereed publication. I like Michael Barabé's distinction between raw writing and cooked writing, right? Blogging is kind of the raw, and then the kind of refereed journal stuff is the cooked stuff.
I work for a magazine, and you know, we're caught up in a news cycle. Since your blogs are for the public, and there's this hope to be more widely read than just within your academic communities, like, do you feel pressure to jump into the news cycle? Do you feel ever that you missed, like, something was a week too late because it already made the front page of the New York Times? Like, if so, how do you deal with it? Like, what, you know, what's that like?
I try to stay ahead of Boing Boing. And they, one of their writers actually reads my blog once in a while, and they've picked up a few things from my blog. I never get a lot of hits back because I'll just be the little credit link at the bottom, but it makes me feel so good when I know it was on my site first.
Actually, I think I get more hits when I get linked to Bitch Ph.D. than when I get linked to CNN, which is really impressive. But I would say two things. One is, I don't write about something if I don't think I can write responsibly about it. And I wish, in fact, I were the kind of blogger like you are, actually, who can do something in a paragraph and have it be really short, really incisive, and just put it out there, bang. I have a tendency to ruminate a little more. So that, for example, the post that's up right now is on Caster Semenya, the runner from South Africa, who has fallen into this whole gender testing thing. And transgender issues are things I've thought about a lot as a queer studies professor. And it's really difficult to figure out how to talk about them with an audience who isn't with the program. It's a good exercise, too. How do you actually communicate this in language that your average educated reader can understand? But I also wanted to do it responsibly, and I wanted to connect it to some bigger historical issues. And when I figured out that I could connect it to sexism in women's sports and homophobia in sports more generally, over the course of the last quarter century, then I figured out how to do it. And I didn't mind that I was behind the news cycle, because I actually thought very few people were saying anything smart about her at all, and that much that was being said was deeply offensive to me, and really racist as well. So that when I figured out what the smart thing was to say, that was fine to be late as far as I was concerned.
I would see myself as sitting more on Eva's side of it, in that I'm always greedy for good links. Like, I'm like, oh, that's a really good one. And obviously, the viral nature of internet communication is such that if there is something really cool, like, it quickly will be all over the place. So I always get really grumpy in August and over holidays, because all of the places online that usually I can count on for good links, everyone's on vacation and they're just using their stuff that they had in the files that wasn't quite thrilling enough to publish. So I'm like, let this holiday weekend be over. Where are my good links? So my posting would be not at all on the model of Alexandra's. I would have more like, you know, a brief post every day, or perhaps even as many as 3 or 4 that often are, in fact, built around a link to something that then prompts, you know, a thought.
I sometimes schedule small posts when I know I'm not going to be able to write for a long time. So, of course, they're already way behind the news because I wrote them maybe a month ago, so they're more general things. But it's just as a filler so that people will keep coming back. So.
Because I read a lot of political blogs and do a little bit of political blogging, I think a lot about news cycle stuff. And I've just kind of come to realize that, you know, I'm not a journalist. I'm not doing any reporting. I'm not doing any actual investigation. So to some extent, either I'm just kind of saying, here's a link to something, you know, that really makes me mad, or sometimes I'll post about stuff well after the news cycle because, as you say, there's more time to think about it. But I'm aware of it, but I don't care.
I'm just curious about commenting, how you deal with it. Do you accept them raw? Do they pull you into topics unexpectedly? And do you feel like it's an obligation as a blogger to go comment on other blogs?
I would say sometimes I don't have time to comment on other blogs, although I do have a group of blogs that I follow regularly and read regularly. I don't comment that frequently, I think, because I try to limit my time on the computer. As you know, blogging can really expand the amount of time you sit there putting off other things that actually really need to be done, like showering and eating and so on. So I do try not to get caught up in other things. I do think there's a phenomenon too where commenters sort of carry a conflict they're having on one blog over to another blog, you know, and it's almost as if they're moving from place to place. And that can be distressing. I do, and you run into a lot of problems with this, I do delete comments. And I have a statement up on my blog about the conditions under which I delete comments. And basically it's if I think they're abusive. And it's a call I have to make, but I don't let people come back over and over again and say horrible things about me. I don't let them make accusations against other people, because those things do remain up online, you know, so that if somebody, you know, says, Eric Foner did blah, 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 blah. You know, you Google Eric Foner and it's going to come up eventually. You know, so I'm actually very aware of how other people's reputations might be impacted by space I'm giving to somebody else. I think the other thing to remember, and this makes it very different from at least certain kinds of journalism, makes it a lot more like Fox News, to tell you the truth, is that people become obsessive on the internet. So that one of the things you run into in comments, and one of the things I know I can certainly fall prey to, is ending up in a kind of back and forth where the points that are really being made are only marginally different from, but you know, you sit there thinking, okay, he really doesn't understand, and I'm really going to get it right this time. And I think it's a waste of time, in truth. I just want to add one more thing without hogging this space, which is I think people see a lot more potential around the exchange of ideas in the blogosphere than there really is at this moment. My sense is that people often comment not because you've changed their mind about anything, but because they like you already and they have something to add to it. Or, you know, they're coming back to say their point of view. But there's not a whole lot of listening in the blogosphere from my perspective.
I might just add, I mean, a couple minor points. I would say that it's been noticeable to me over the last couple years as more people shift to reading blogs, let's say through a feed reader like Google Reader or something like that. It certainly makes it much less likely that I'll comment on someone's blog. If I'm just reading through the feed, I might like a post, but I would have to feel the impulse to go there especially to comment. And I actually see myself as now being much more likely to just write an email to the author in response, so that it's back to the sense of a conversation between blogger and an individual reader rather than a conversation in a communal space. So that you might think of it as being that now there's a proportion of blogs that have very active, even if nobody's listening to each other, comment sections with strings of hundreds of comments. But I would think that as a smaller blog like mine, you know, I've continued to build up readership, definitely, but I notice much fewer regular commenters than a couple years ago, just because of this change in the culture of reading. And I also see that I just have a lot of email correspondences with the people who once would have been commenters.
See, to me, I think participating in the comments section is important, is a big deal. Both because, like you, I'll delete comments. Like I'll police my comments, and my comment policy is, you know, if it's obnoxious, I'll delete it, and that's it. Like I'm not going to explain what I mean by that. So, I mean, and I use that to keep down the like big flame wars and stuff. But to me, ultimately, blogging is really, it's a social medium. And that's why I say, you know, academically, it's service, maybe it's you know, advertisement for your university or your department. But you know, participating in comments and responding to the people who participate in my comment threads, to me is part of that, building that social aspect and the trust that then enables people, hopefully, to listen and actually converse.
On my Eastern Bloc blog, I don't get a lot of comments because I filter out the spam, and 90% of them are just spam things that find me through Google. But on the other blog, on Nature Network, I get a lot more comments, even though there is actually a procedure that you have to have an account there before you're even allowed to leave a comment. So it discourages people who just randomly find you in Google and want to say something nasty, because now they have to spend 5 minutes typing in their name and email address. But because you have to have an account, there's this entire community that all comments on each other's blogs, and the front page even has a list of the most commented blogs. So they're not actively trying to get on the list, but being on the list is quite an honor, because now your blog shows up like right on top of the page. So there are a lot of discussions going on one blog that continue on another blog, and the danger of it is that it can lead to a bit of cliquishness, where people who do just come in to comment on one blog find themselves stuck in a discussion that they can't really follow, because there's this group of people that all read each other's blogs, and I think you might have that in your fields as well.
We certainly have time for a couple more questions. I think we've got almost 10 minutes more, so I urge those of you who have something on your mind to go ahead and ask.
Hi. I've heard you mention links a couple of times, and I'm wondering if you actively reach out so that people can find you, or you just, I know that you're well-known bloggers here, but if somebody were starting one, how would people find them if they're not based at an institution?
I was thinking that actually with the previous question too, that I have now had a number of friends or students or whoever who start up a blog and then say, but no one's reading me. And I say, well, what blogs do you read? And they say, none. And I'm like, well, obviously, so in other words, I also have a triathlon training blog. And so that's a different blogosphere that I have been a part of, and that's where you see really clearly. I leave comments much more frequently on triathlon blogs because someone says, I had a terrible workout and I have this race and I'm worried about it, and I say, don't worry, it'll be fun. So that the community feel of it is very strong there, and it was clear to me because I started that blog up much more recently. It was clear to me that really commenting on someone else's blog with that link back to your blog, and there's some appropriate overlap between the two, is really the way to solidly build some kind of a readership over time. There's no replacement for that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the blogs that I follow, I found because someone left a comment that I found interesting. Yeah. They said something intelligent or pointed out something I hadn't thought of or whatever, and I go click on that little homepage link, and I try to throw links to people who I know are not big bloggers yet. So
I think that's true. I think some of the online journals that are attached to paper journals, or some of the journals that are just online, like Inside Higher Ed, is a much more sort of loosey-goosey type of publication. It's totally online. They link a lot of blogs. If you ever get linked to Inside Higher Ed, everybody reads you. I mean, you'll just see a huge jump right there. And if you're looking for blogs to read, going on Inside Higher Ed is really important because they have a number of regular blogs that are hosted there, but then there's also a section where they will link, 2 or 3 posts every day of something they found that's worth reading. It's also true that if you write something and link to say the Chronicle of Higher Ed, or link to the New Yorker or something like that, they'll find you because that's what SiteMeter does. Okay, if you have a SiteMeter on your blog, it records the addresses that people came to you from. Okay, so if you are linking other places, eventually somebody's going to notice, and this is how I've gotten linked to like the National Review, which was a somewhat peculiar experience, and CNN, Fox News I got linked to. It's, you link to something, if they're getting a lot of hits from your blog, invariably they're going to go and say, what is this? And keep an eye on you. And which I think is actually one of the most enticing things about blogging nowadays, because it's simply true that with fewer and fewer print publications, it's harder to get published. It's particularly hard to get published in a way that people who aren't academics are going to read you, just regular, intelligent readers. And that's a really big change in the last quarter century. It's also a really big change that you need so many connections to get published in a place like The Nation, or, places where you want to be read by, say, like-minded individuals, or the National Review, if you're conservative. And to get published in the National Review as a liberal would be unheard of, right? So I think there is some potential, more potential than there is with paper publications nowadays, for those links actually allowing you to be read by people who will take an interest in you, people who wouldn't ordinarily find you in the world.
I'm also noticing that we've all talked about passive ways of getting yourself noticed. Leave a comment and then, hopefully someone will follow you. And I want to I'm like, maybe this is because we're all women. To also say, email someone and say, I've written, I write about this, here's a link. And if it's a conversational enough email and isn't spammy sounding, people will usually follow it. And I've definitely had people who have brought blogs to my attention or posts to my attention that were things that they knew that I would be interested in because of what I write about. And then I'll usually do a post and say, oh, look at this interesting blog about such and such. So, you know, that's the other thing, is just to ask.
As someone who blogs often about books, I get a lot of really annoying, basically promotional emails. I hate getting emails from publicists who don't have a good sense of what I would actually be likely to read and write about. But I almost more hate getting emails from authors of books who are inappropriately sort of pitching me in some sense, and it really makes me feel very negative. So I would actually say, like, if I would be much more likely to come to someone's blog if they left a comment a couple times and I thought, oh, well, who is this person? This is interesting. If they sent me an email that said, hi, I'm this and I've started up a new blog, it's worthy of your attention, I would not be very likely to go there.
See, well, that kind of email is what I mean by spammy. Like, it's kind of vague, and you could send it out to 37 people. But if it's something like, I've been following your blog,
if it's clearly a personal email, I would probably follow up.
Well, I would also say, and this was a total accident, really, that one of the reasons my blog got a lot of readership very fast is I wrote a lot of posts that were aimed at graduate students who were on the job market. And a lot of sort of advice for those who were job seekers. And those posts got spread around really, really fast because graduate students, even in a very competitive marketplace like this one, are basically much more invested in their communities than people who aren't graduate students. And they're much more invested in each other's success often than faculty are. And so they spread them around, and eventually that sort of, actually quite quickly, that percolated up to graduate advisors. Because there is, of course, a whole thing going on in the job market where, potential candidates are being produced by institutions that are unlike the institution that is ultimately going to hire them, right? And so there are all kinds of people giving them advice about how to get jobs, that's totally inappropriate because they've actually never worked at the place that would give their graduate student a job, right? So as somebody who has run many, many search committees in my life, I had, I would say, 10 or 15 really, really focused posts that were aimed at that group in particular. So the lesson I would draw from that is establishing some kind of a theme very early on for your blog gives you the possibility of actually picking up the readers that you want.
Well, perhaps we'll just all stick around for a few minutes and can take individual questions. But thanks again to the sponsors of the event and to this wonderful group of panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.